Now, most people think that if people are following you, you are a leader. If people are doing what you tell them to do, you are a leader. No, that's not leadership. I mean, even the Pied Piper could get people to follow him, but let's not call that leadership. That's seduction, that's persuasion, that's coercion. Certainly that might be needed from time to time, but real leadership is way more than that. And that's what I want to talk about today. 6 principles of real leadership to help you to address complex problems and challenges, to help you to be a more effective agent of positive change. Principle number 1, distinguish adaptive challenges from technical challenges. This is an important distinction, the distinction between adaptive challenges or technical challenges, adaptive work versus technical work. It's a simple distinction, but it's an essential distinction. Adaptive challenges need leadership, and technical challenges need good management or authority. Adaptive challenges are complex and messy challenges. They are different from technical challenges. A technical problem is relatively straightforward in that it can be resolved through the application of current expertise, current knowledge, or the expression of authority. An adaptive problem is generally connected to people and their values, their behavior, or their priorities. You cannot succeed in addressing a problem or making a change or producing an innovation unless you produce a shift in the thinking of people, in how they see the problem, or in their relationship to the challenge. Also, an adaptive challenge often has a degree of complexity in that it has interconnected parts or it involves multiple groups. So you may have to cross boundaries and engage others in the adaptive work. Now, technical problems, on the other hand, are relatively straightforward. You bring resolution to these problems by applying the knowledge you have already accrued. You know what the problem is and what is needed to address it. Now let me talk about why we use the term adaptive, as in adaptive leadership or adaptive challenge or adaptive work. Now my mentor and colleague at Harvard, Ronald Heifetz, he was really the first person to speak to this in a leadership context. Now, in nature, a successful adaptation is a positive response to threatening complexity or changed conditions, and it opens up new possibilities for surviving and potentially thriving. For example, a new predator comes into an animal's territory, or there is a flood or a volcano or some intense natural disaster that disrupts the animal's habitat. It is forced to make an adaptation to respond to the changed conditions, or it dies out. Institutions and organizations, businesses and corporations, they must do adaptive work all the time to respond to changed conditions. Changes in technology, changes in the marketplace, changes in competition, changes in customer preferences, changes in human resources, and the list goes on. If a company cannot make those critical adaptations with speed and effectiveness, they'll be pushed to the wayside, left behind. They might even collapse, or at best be gobbled up or merged with a bigger, more successful company. For example, we can look at the list of Fortune 100 companies or Fortune 500 companies, big companies. If you compare the list of 30 years ago with the list of today, very few of those companies that were on that list 30 years ago are still around today. They have fallen by the wayside, or they have merged with larger companies. Now, let's look at one company that has been very successful the last 30 years, but is currently struggling. That company is Starbucks. We've all heard of Starbucks. It's in the news right now as we speak. Its global sales have been declining the last few years, and its stock price up and down like a yo-yo. It's not experiencing the growth it enjoyed in the past. They've actually had 4 different CEOs the last 4 years. That's a technical response, and it hasn't led to the problem being fixed. So they've tried technical solutions like changing CEOs, changing the menu, changing coffee mugs, but that hasn't fixed the problem. I mean, we can all appreciate competition in the coffee shop business is very fierce. New competitors are emerging on a daily basis, so we, the consumer, have a lot of options. Now, the new CEO recently spoke to staff and also to shareholders, where he outlined the challenge. He declared that they had to fundamentally change their strategy, change their approach, change the way the business is being managed, change the customer experience, and change the attitude of staff if they are to get back on that trajectory of growth that they've enjoyed over the last few decades. I mean, he clearly realizes they face a more complex challenge, or in our language, an adaptive challenge. And often an adaptive challenge is multifaceted, multi-layered, and multidimensional. That's why it can be messy and complex. And you cannot do the adaptive work without the engagement of the factions and the groups that are a part of the larger system in which the problem is embedded. Now, Starbucks is a global business, and each country has its own unique elements. So each country will need to be involved in the adaptive work to figure out what's missing, what works and what does not, and how to compete in specific environments. Now, the point is, with a tough challenge, if it does not get resolved to satisfy the mission, the strategy, the objectives of the organization, even when management gives it its best shot to fix the problem in a technical way, it is probably a more complex adaptive challenge that needs leadership to facilitate the adaptive work. It will require a richer diagnosis of what's really going on and a significant amount of experimentation to discover the best solution or to produce an innovative response. It might even need some kind of cultural shift because the practices, the values, the habits, or the mindsets of people inside the organization have become to some degree maladaptive or counterproductive or ineffective. Therefore, the leadership work will be to figure out what values to promote, what values to change, what values to discard. Also, if you feel like you've hit a wall and the current repertoire of competence or strategy or way of doing things isn't delivering the desired result, then the adaptive work will require a significant degree of creative work, thinking outside the box, playing with ideas to figure out what an innovative solution might be. And the work of leadership is to trigger and manage the creative work and the amount of experimentation and exploration needed to generate an effective innovation or adaptation. Principle number 2, to make progress on an important adaptive challenge, you need to distinguish leadership from authority, and you need to encourage the expression of leadership from multiple quarters and not just from the dominant authority figure or the authority structure. Now, in our adaptive leadership framework, this is one of the most important distinctions. Now, the traditional conception of leadership is that the authority figure is the leader, and whatever he or she does is leadership. That's why in conventional leadership theories there is common reference to leaders and followers. It implies that leadership means getting people to follow you or abide by your orders or directives. That's why I made reference to the Pied Piper dynamic at the beginning. I mean, you can be charismatic, you can be persuasive, or you can express dominance, but none of that is an indicator of leadership. It may help from time to time in your leadership work, but it's not the primary indicator. In the adaptive leadership framework, we look at leadership as a problem-solving process. Not simple problems, but tough problems, complex problems, adaptive problems. That set of problems you must work your way through in order to make progress. Now, in our framework, the indicator of leadership is not if people are following you. The indicator is, are people addressing the important problem or set of problems that is in front of them? Are they facing the reality of the situation, the reality of their predicament? Are they facing the reality of the threats and dangers or potential opportunities before them? Are they taking responsibility for that body of work that needs to be addressed in order to advance or to add value to the organization or the community? That's why it's important to distinguish leadership from authority. And authority always has a role to play, but it is insufficient for complex problems, for creative work, for the work of change. Now, all groups, traditional and modern, have authority structures. There's no escape from that. It's like gravity, it's just there. Obviously, there are wonderful benefits and strengths to the authority function, particularly if it is done well. When it is not done well, you have a ton of problems. People lose trust in their authority figures to protect them and provide essential services and feed basic hungers, for example. Now, I've spent a lot of time studying traditional cultures and tribes and the role and function of authority. Tribes have boundaries, cultural and territorial boundaries. They have authority figures to maintain and protect those boundaries. For example, when I was with a tribe in the jungles of Borneo many years ago as a doctoral student, I saw the chief chastise some young men because they were playing loud pop music on their cassette player. They brought the cassette player back from a local town many miles away. And I think they were playing Madonna, and the chief did not appreciate that irritating noise wafting through the rainforest. So he told them to stop. We don't do that. We don't listen to that. Not here. That's what authority figures do. They let you know what is acceptable or unacceptable, what is right, what is wrong. They also reward and they also punish. Their job is to protect the boundaries. Their job is to keep the system functioning. Their job is to maintain some semblance of order. Their job is to protect the group and its resources. Their job is to manage what comes in, what goes out. Also, each person has a role to play, and the authority structure makes sure people play their respective roles. So you need people to hunt, to gather fruit, to cook the meal, and fight your battles and what have you. Now, with the tribe in Borneo, the chief was the authority figure, and his expertise came from what he had been taught from his father, from the elders. The knowledge of the past could be applied to most of the challenges and problems in the present. But when I was with them, the tribe, and the chief in particular, was struggling to address an adaptive challenge. The adaptive challenge of dealing with the emergence of new threats and dangers coming from the intrusion of the outside world. Logging companies were destroying their habitat, cutting down the forests and what have you. The government was trying to move the tribe out of the forest and into villages, and this was wreaking havoc on their culture, on their lifestyle, on their lives. Now, my point here is that to respond to this kind of novel challenge, it generally requires an approach that is outside the current repertoire that authority can provide. It needs more imagination and flexibility and experimentation and exploration. It needs more leadership, as it is an adaptive challenge. And depending on how complex that challenge is, the expression of leadership can come from many people and not exclusively from the dominant authority figure. Anyone can exercise leadership with or without formal positional authority, obviously in varying degrees and in varying ways. But the more expressions of leadership beyond what comes from the formal authority structure, the better a group can address a complex challenge. Principle number 3. Know what is at stake and be able to articulate what is at stake in a way that makes sense to the people you are interacting with. With an adaptive challenge, there is always something at stake. You can gain something or you might lose something. If nothing is at stake, it's not a leadership challenge. Whether you paint your room blue or green does not matter. It doesn't require leadership. That's management. That's technical. That's personal preference. The stakes are not high. Leadership is about helping people change and learn and to adapt to a novel or changing environment. If there's no compelling reason to change, in other words, no threats or dangers or nothing to be gained, nothing is at stake, then you probably don't need leadership. Authority can do its job just fine. If the stakes are high, if a problem will persist, if things might get worse, if there might be a great loss, then you need leadership. You need to help people to understand what is at stake, why change is needed, why they need to address the adaptive challenge, why this is important work. It needs to make sense to them. They need to feel it in their bones so that they can find the energy to tackle the adaptive work, to do something about it. I mean, it's like a parent. If you're trying to get your kid to do their homework, to read good books, or to get off addictive, stupid social media, for example, the stakes are high, but the teenager doesn't feel it in their bones yet. It's not an easy thing to do to get people to truly appreciate what the stakes are and why change is needed and their personal responsibility for contributing to the adaptive work. But that is the challenge of leadership. And I should mention that the adaptive work is not only with your own group, but often across boundaries. It adds a layer of complexity to leadership work, but problems are often interdependent. Therefore, multiple groups must appreciate what the stakes are, why the challenge is important, and their role in contributing to addressing the challenge. As an aside, all those years ago when I was studying the tribe in Borneo, it was wonderful to meet and see the late Prince Philip, the Queen's husband. He came to Borneo in his role with the World Wildlife Fund. It was interesting to watch how he highlighted what was at stake as it pertained to the protection and preservation of the magnificent rainforests of Borneo, and how he challenged the governments there to protect and preserve these rainforests, and to include the indigenous people in the problem-solving work or the adaptive work and the maintenance work of these forests. And to be honest, I did not expect much from him. I thought it would be just a performative things, like the things that royals do. But I was actually quite impressed with how serious he was and how he used his platform to spotlight the challenge, to challenge the authority figures in that part of the world, and to partner with local groups to tackle the challenge. Now, I remember when they took him around, he would often demand that the entourage stop or take him to a place that was not on the itinerary. And he would wander off and have a conversation with some random person about their relationship to these forests. He wanted to hear from them, and he also wanted the government officials to hear that perspective as well. And I thought at the time, yeah, good for him. That contribution is helping. And this leads to principle number 4. Treat adaptive work as learning work. Treat adaptive work as learning work. Because there are many unknowns about an adaptive challenge, you've got to go into learning mode to figure out what's going on and what might work to bring resolution to the challenge. You're at the frontier of a problem, and you're often at the frontier of your competence. So the work of leadership is to facilitate a learning process. It's not only learning about the problem, but learning about the system in which the problem is embedded. It is learning about how to invent and implement an appropriate solution and how to sustain the successful implementation of that solution or strategy over time. Also, in implementing a solution or a strategy, inevitably there will be errors made along the way. New problems will be encountered along the way. So course corrections will need to be made swiftly and effectively. The course correction process should be treated as a learning process. It is an essential element of adaptive work. Now, a helpful way to think about the kind of learning I'm talking about is to look at the work of Chris Argyris. Chris Argyris. He was an eminent professor of organizational behavior or organizational learning at Harvard University. He was one of my mentors when I was a graduate student, a great professor. Now, he created this framework to illustrate the challenge or the demands of deep learning for problem solving and change. His work is relevant to leadership and the doing of adaptive work. Argyris looks at how managers address problems, take action, and get results. He breaks it down into 3 domains. There are assumptions or beliefs, a premise, how we see the world, how we see the problem, and there are the actions that we take, the strategies we deploy, our approach to addressing a challenge. And there are the outcomes, the results, the impact that we get. If the outcome is not what you want, you can come back and modify or change your actions, your strategy, your approach. That's technical learning. You can make a change without changing the underlying program, shall we say. If that doesn't resolve the problem, then you have to go deeper and modify or change the underlying assumptions or the beliefs or the premise. This is harder to do, but that is adaptive learning. But the learning can even go deeper and modify or change values, particularly if those values are maladaptive or not particularly useful. Argyris called the modification of approach or style or strategy single loop learning. We can call it technical learning. The modification of assumptions or beliefs he called double loop learning. That's an expression of adaptive work. And the modification of values we can call triple loop learning, which is a deeper expression of adaptive work and potentially transformational, because when you change values, you open up a whole new set of possibilities. Now, the point here is, leadership is needed to facilitate or orchestrate deeper adaptive learning that goes beyond the limitations of technical learning or superficial change. That unfolds through the quality of the dialogue, the quality of the communication, the quality of partnership, the quality of your experimentation, your exploration, and your testing of assumptions and ideas. So learning work is fundamental to the doing of adaptive work. And this leads to principle number 5. For an adaptive challenge, seek to understand what is going on in the background that is impeding progress on the commitment or the challenge in the foreground. This relates to principle number 4, getting at the assumptions and the priorities. But it's more than that. With an adaptive challenge, There is often something going on in the background with people's loyalties, their values, their commitments, their obligations, or even their cultural practices. And these things may be more important to them than embracing the change or addressing the problem or doing the creative work of generating an innovation of some sort. In the foreground is what people espouse, what they say they are committed to, or what they want to see happen. But in the background are these powerful forces that keep you from progressing. For example, it's like you want to become super fit and healthy, but you just cannot give up beer and ice cream. You don't want to put in the time to exercise. So something is holding you back. There's a competing priority in your head, in your lifestyle. Something is going on, something that might be conscious, but it's often unconscious because it's habitual or it's cultural. And the work of leadership is to bring the background concerns to the foreground, to help people appreciate how one foot might be nailed to the ground and it's keeping them from advancing. Now let me give you a simple example from my time working in Madagascar as an advisor to the government. Madagascar is a very poor country and needs a lot of leadership work at all levels. Now, I remember there was a village where an NGO built a well and provided a solar water purifier and a pump for the village. I should mention that the women in this village would spend more than an hour every day going back and forth to a river or a stream to collect water. With this new technology, they did not have to do that. However, after a few weeks, the well and the pump were destroyed. Somebody did not want it. After an investigation, we found that the women were responsible. After talking with them, they explained that this was a disruption to their lives. It was a threat. They had always been the water carriers. That was their role. Now they had to be in the village all day, every day, around annoying men, and they did not like that. On the surface, this looked like a technical challenge. It was treated as a technical challenge, a simple problem with a simple solution. You need clean, purified water. We can do that for you with this new technology. But it actually had an adaptive component because the change was connected to the role, the identity, and the values of women. Now, I asked them if they were consulted on the change, and they said it sounded like a good idea at the time, but they did not realize the impact it would have on them. They did not realize at the time that they would have to sustain a loss to their cultural practice, their role as women, if they were to embrace this new technology. Therefore, they sabotaged the new technology. They sabotaged and subverted the change. And sometimes the background is so deep and so entrenched, it's embedded in a deeper narrative of who people are and how they should live their lives and their beliefs about what is right and what is wrong. In other words, to them it has a very deep and profound moral component, a sacred narrative, and you violate that narrative or you violate that moral component or those practices at your own peril. I'll give you another example from Madagascar. I visited a remote tribe where baby twins, whenever they were born, they were taken out into the forest and left to die. This practice has been done for centuries. It's terrible and it's tantamount to murder. And I met with the tribal king who explained to me that this was needed because twins are cursed. Their presence in the community causes bad things to happen, like a cyclone or a drought or an epidemic. And he explained that this tradition, this practice, it began hundreds of years ago when the tribe was attacked by another tribe. And as they fled, a mother with twins slowed the group down, resulting in people being killed. So from that time forth, it was declared that twins must be killed as they were bad luck. Now, no amount of technical work such as laws or policing has been able to resolve this terrible problem. It's an adaptive challenge as it is embedded in cultural practices. It is embedded in their communal identity. It is embedded in a deeper narrative of good and bad, right and wrong, and what they need to do to protect themselves. So when dealing with a change or a complex problem, an adaptive challenge, particularly when you are not getting any traction, you're not getting any movement, but you are facing a lot of resistance, the work of leadership is to diagnose what is the big belief, the sacred value, or the essential story that is prevalent in the background. In this case, in Madagascar, it is the superstition that twins are evil, and to protect the village, twins must be killed, treated as a scapegoat. Now let me say something about superstitions, because all groups, even modern organizations, have superstitions. I'm using the term superstition somewhat loosely here, but a superstition is essentially anything believed to be true that is not true, that impacts how people go about their lives, the choices that they make, and the work that they do. Scapegoating, for example, is a superstition that externalizes the blame for a problem and diminishes personal responsibility. The belief being that if we just get rid of that person or that group, all will be well. We are absolved of any responsibility. Now, most superstitions are trivial. They are not a big deal, like the belief that you should avoid a black cat. But there are serious superstitions or myths that people feel obligated to honor or to promote, just like in Madagascar. People believe things have to be done that way. You might say they don't just have a superstition, the superstition has them. And the work of leadership might be to partner with others to generate a new compelling narrative, or at least to modify the prevailing narrative, particularly when it has something that could be considered maladaptive, counterproductive, or potentially destructive. That is a very demanding leadership challenge. Not an easy thing to do, but it is an important aspect of leadership work. And it takes time, and you need to partner with other change agents and actors in the system and the boundary keepers to do that kind of adaptive work. But it must be done, and must be done with great sensitivity and care. Now for the last principle, principle number 6. Leadership can be exercised along a continuum. Sometimes when we think about leadership and adaptive challenges, it can be a bit overwhelming, a daunting undertaking, like climbing Mount Everest or something. Like, I got to do all these things. But I think a good way to think about leadership is that leadership can be expressed or manifest along a continuum. You can be an agent of change along a continuum. What do I mean by that? At one end of the continuum, there are big acts of leadership, and the other end, there are small acts of leadership. And depending on your role and the nature of the challenge, you can come at it from different angles. For example, a big act of leadership might be orchestrating a process of putting a man on the moon, or figuring out how to transform your company, or resolving a war or a conflict, or the stopping of the killing of twins in Madagascar. That's daunting work. But there are small acts of leadership that we can do every day, like having a conversation with someone that changes how you work together or how they see a problem. The small act of leadership can generate an opening that wasn't there before. It moves people along incrementally in addressing a complex challenge. Maybe people feel stuck, constrained, but a good conversation can free them up, help them to reinterpret the problem and how they can go about addressing it. That's an expression of leadership. That is the work of a change agent, to help people reinterpret their relationship to the challenge that is before them. Yes, the big challenge might be to help people to face hard realities, things that they would prefer to avoid. But these small acts of leadership can help in ripening an issue over time, so that people steadily understand and appreciate and digest the need for change, or whatever it might be. Also, the reality is that even if you have a big leadership challenge, the only way to deliver on that challenge is through multiple small acts of leadership, small conversations, small experiments, small acts of support to keep the adaptive challenge in motion, to keep people engaged, to keep the attention on the issue. That's why you want many people exercising leadership, so there are multiple acts of leadership contributing to the adaptive work. Also, if you are a good authority figure, you will encourage and support and protect people trying to exercise some degree of leadership, even though their interventions might be sloppy or somewhat irritating or disruptive. You can use your authority to frame the challenge or provide a general sense of purpose, but then step back and allow others to contribute in that space. You don't want people to be excessively authority dependent, always looking to the authority figure to fix everything or tell them what to do, as that will only stifle initiative. It will stifle the adaptive work. It'll stifle creative problem solving and stifle the expression of personal responsibility, and that's not a good thing. Okay, I think that's enough for today. There's a lot of leadership work to be done, and there is way too much counterfeit leadership out there. Way too much negative or counterproductive tribalism that is pulling people apart. So we need people to exercise leadership, to be these agents of change, to help people transcend the tribal impulse, to build these bridges of collaboration and cooperation, and to harness the power of diversity for creative problem solving and the doing of adaptive work. It's not easy work, and it's risky work. I mean, I know it often feels like you're being tossed around on the open ocean in these stormy seas. You cannot take the risk out of leadership work or the doing of adaptive work, but you can increase your effectiveness in the face of risk. That's why I've set up the channel. So good luck in your leadership efforts. I wish you well, and I'll talk to you next time. Take care.